The first successful deep submarine rescue in history. 7 men were lifted onto the Falcon's bronze deck, wrapped in blankets, checked by doctors. Some were suffering from exposure and chlorine gas poisoning, but all would recover. Word spread instantly through the assembled ships and to shore. Families waiting at Portsmouth Naval Base heard the news. Cheers erupted. Women embraced. Some collapsed in relief. The chamber works. They can be saved. But there was no time for celebration. 26 men remained trapped below. The weather was deteriorating. The seas were getting rougher. The wind was picking up. Each minute that passed increased the risk that conditions would become too dangerous to continue operations. Chief Machinist's mate William Batters operated the McCann chamber more than anyone else in training. He knew the equipment intimately. He understood its capabilities and limitations. He also knew the weather window was closing. Batters made a decision that may have saved lives. Against the planned schedule, he brought up 8 men on the second trip instead of the planned 7. The chamber was designed to carry 7 survivors plus 2 operators. 8 survivors would push the limits, but Batters judged the chamber could handle the extra weight. Lieutenant Commander Momsen watched the chamber rise and thought it looked heavy. The cable strained under the load. When Batters surfaced, Momsen told him, "You brought out too many men on this trip, but do it again." Momsen understood Bad's reasoning. Better to push the equipment than to leave men below if conditions worsened. Batters made the 3rd descent at 1500 hours. 9 more men climbed into the chamber and rode it to the surface. The chamber was now seriously overloaded, carrying 9 survivors, plus 2 operators. But the equipment held. By 1800 hours, only 7 men remained in the Squalus. Lieutenant Naquan and 6 others. One more trip would complete the impossible rescue. The 4th descent began at 1841 hours. Everything proceeded normally. The chamber descended along the guide wires, made contact with the hull, sealed. The last 7 men climbed inside. Lieutenant Naquan, the last to leave his submarine, sealed the hatch behind him. He took one final look at the control room where he had commanded the Squalus for 2 months. Then, he climbed into the rescue chamber. The chamber began its ascent toward safety. Then disaster struck. The steel cable connecting the chamber to the Falcon became fouled. Something had gone wrong with the winch mechanism. The chamber stalled at 100 feet below the surface. Inside, the 7 survivors and 2 chamber operators realized they had stopped moving. The cable was twisted, damaged. If it snapped completely, they would plunge back to the bottom. The chamber would be crushed by water pressure. Everyone inside would die. On the Falcon, Momsen and his team worked frantically. They could not risk pulling harder on the cable. It might break completely. They needed to lower the chamber back to the submarine, level the load, and somehow fix the fouled cable. 2 divers prepared to descend in the dark. Night had fallen. The seas were rough. Diving conditions were as bad as they could be while still attempting work. Chief Torpedan Walter Squire volunteered first. He descended through the black water, fighting the current. He found the fouled cable wrapped around itself, kinked and twisted. He worked to remove it, but he could only partly succeed. His efforts sent the chamber bouncing across the Squalus hull. The men inside were thrown about. Some were injured by the violent movements. Torpedoman's mate, Jesse Duncan, was sent down next to remove the half-broken wire completely. Duncan descended into the darkness, his powerful underwater lamp barely penetrating the murk. He found the cable and began working on it, but Duncan became entangled in the cable. His air hose wrapped around the twisted steel. He couldn't free himself. Running out of air and delirious from nitrogen neurosis, he barely made it back to the surface alive. He was hauled aboard the Falcon unconscious and required immediate medical attention. A 3rd diver descended. He too was unsuccessful in freeing the cable. The fouled wire was too damaged to repair at depth in the darkness. The men in the chamber had now been suspended in the dark water for over 3 hours, exhausted, terrified. Some were suffering from carbon dioxide buildup as the air inside the chamber degraded. The situation was becoming critical. Momsen made a decision that seemed impossible. They would manually lift the 21,600 chamber. 6 men on the Falcon took hold of the cable. Momsen himself grabbed the cable alongside them. They pulled with all their strength. The chamber did not move. The weight was too great. Momsen ordered the men inside the chamber to blow the ballast tanks for 15 seconds. The cable. The 6 men pulled again. Still too heavy. The chamber barely budged. Blow ballast for another 15 seconds. Pull. The chamber moved slightly, a few inches, then stopped. A third attempt. Blow ballast. Pull. The chamber began to rise. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the men on the Falcon hauled the chamber upward. Their arms burned, their backs strained, their hands bled where the cable cut into their flesh. But failure was not an option. Men's lives depended on every pull. More sailors joined the effort. 10 men, then 15, all pulling together in rhythm. Momsen called out the cadence. Pull, rest, pull, rest. The chamber rose through the water. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. The cable creaked and groaned. Everyone feared it would snap at any moment, but it held. At 0030 hours on May 25th, 39 hours after the Squalus sank, the rescue chamber broke the surface for the final time. Lieutenant Oliver Naquin and 6 other men were lifted onto the deck of the Falcon. All 33 survivors had been rescued. 4 separate trips to a depth of 240 feet. 13 hours of continuous operations. 33 lives saved. The device that Charles Momsen had conceived after watching helpless as the S-51 crew died had finally achieved its purpose. The news spread across the nation and around the world. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the miraculous rescue. Photographs of the survivors wrapped in blankets arriving at Portsmouth Naval Yard became iconic images. The families waiting on shore erupted in celebration when the final group arrived. Wives embraced their husbands. Children clung to their fathers. The relief was overwhelming. The Squalus rescue represented more than just 33 saved lives. It shattered the fatalistic assumption that submarine disasters meant certain death. For the first time in history, submariners had hoped that rescue was possible even from depths previously considered unreachable. The Navy moved immediately to expand the McCann Chamber program. More chambers were built and distributed to submarine rescue ships around the world. Training intensified. Procedures were refined based on the lessons learned during the Squalus operation. The men who made the rescue possible were recognized for their extraordinary heroism. Chief Machinist's mate, William Baders, received the Medal of Honor for his critical decision to bring up more men than planned and his skilled operation of the rescue chamber under deteriorating conditions. Chief Torpedoman John Malofsky received the Medal of Honor for making the first dangerous descent in the chamber and establishing contact with the trapped crew. Chief Bosun's mate Orson Crannell received the Medal of Honor for his diving work attaching the guide cables under hazardous conditions. Chief metalsmith James McDonald received the Medal of Honor for his repeated dangerous dives, attempting to free the fouled cable during the final ascent. 46 others were awarded the Navy Cross for their roles in the rescue operation. Commander Cyrus Cole received the Distinguished Service Medal for leading the overall operation with skill and determination. Lieutenant Commander Charles Momsen received commendation from the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Navy. Alan Rockwell Mackin, whose modifications had made the rescue chamber practical, received recognition for his engineering contributions. But the story of the Squalus was not finished. 26 men remained in TP'd in the flooded aft compartments. The Navy made the decision to attempt something that seemed even more impossible than the rescue. They would raise the submarine from the ocean floor. The salvage operation would prove to be one of the most complex and dangerous engineering projects ever undertaken. The salvage effort required 4 months of continuous effort, multiple teams of divers working in brutal conditions, innovative techniques that had never been attempted before. Momsen directed the salvage operations with the same determined precision he had brought to the rescue. The plan involved attaching multiple large pontoons to the submarine's hull. These pontoons, when flooded, would sink to the submarine's depth. Once attached, compressed air would be pumped into them, creating buoyancy to lift the submarine. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. Divers made hundreds of descents to 240 feet to attach cables, drill holes for the pontoon connections, and prepare the submarine for lifting. Several divers suffered from the bends. Some were permanently injured, but the work continued. Slowly, methodically, the submarine was prepared for her return to the surface. The pontoons were massive steel cylinders, each capable of providing thousands of pounds of lift. They had to be precisely positioned and attached. If one broke free during the ascent, it could cause the bow submarine to roll or sink back to the bottom. The calculations were complex. The margin for error was zero. Navy engineers worked around the clock computing buoyancy, weight distribution, and lifting forces. On September 13, 1939, the Squalus broke the surface. The submarine emerged slowly, pontoons on either side, keeping her upright. Water streamed from every opening. She was towed carefully back to Portsmouth Naval Yard, where she was placed in dry dock. The sight of the raised submarine drew thousands of spectators. Some came to witness history. Others came to mourn. A Navy Board of Inquiry concluded that a mechanical failure in the operating gear of the engine air induction valve had caused the disaster. The valve, which should have closed automatically when the submarine submerged, had remained open. Sea otter poured through the 36-inch diameter opening, flooding the aft compartments in minutes. The investigation exonerated the Squalus crew, and Item commended Lieutenant Naquin for his outstanding leadership during the crisis. His calm command had kept the survivors alive long enough for rescue to arrive. Based on the findings, the Navy converted submarine hull valves to quick-closing flapper valves to prevent future similar tragedies. The modification was implemented across the entire submarine fleet. The Squalus disaster, though tragic, led to improvements that saved countless lives in future years. 25 bodies were recovered from the wreckage during the salvage operation. The men were found in the flooded compartments where they had drowned. Some had been thrown against bulkheads by the force of the incoming water. Others had drowned trying to reach watertight doors. All had died within minutes of the initial flooding. The 26th victim apparently drifted out to sea when a hatch was opened during the salvage effort. His body was never recovered. The recovered men were given full military honors and buried in time, ceremonies that drew thousands of mourners. The funerals took place over several days as families traveled to Portsmouth. The cemetery in Kittery, Maine, became the final resting place for these sailors. Their graves stand in neat rows, a permanent reminder of the price of submarine service. The Squalus itself was repaired, refitted with new equipment, and returned to service. But she would never again bear the name associated with disaster. On February 9, 1940, the submarine was recommissioned with a new identity, USS Sailfish. The rechristened submarine would go on to serve with distinction throughout World War II. Under various commanding officers, the Sailfish conducted 9 war patrols in the Pacific Theater. She departed Portsmouth on January 16, 1941, for the Philippines. When war broke out in December 1941, Sailfish was one of the few submarines in position to immediately engage Japanese forces. Over the course of the war, she sank approximately 7 enemy vessels and damaged 8 others. Her most significant victory came on December 4, 1943, when she torpedoed and sank the Japanese aircraft carrier Chuyo. The sinking of Chuyo had a tragic irony. Unknown to the Sailfish crew at the time, the carrier was transporting American prisoners of war, including survivors from the USS Squalus. The Squalus, which had searched for the Squalus and been present during the rescue, had herself been sunk by Japanese depth charges on November 19, 1943. 21 Squalus survivors were captured and placed aboard Chuyo for transport to Japan. When Sailfish torpedoed Chuyo, the carrier sank quickly. Only one of the Squalus survivors survived both sinkings. The submarine Sailfish received 9 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation for her wartime service. Some of the men who had been rescued from the Squalus volunteered to serve aboard the Sailfish, showing remarkable courage in returning to submarine duty after their near-death experience. Their willingness to return to sea demonstrated the character of these sailors and their faith in the improved safety measures implemented after the disaster. Lieutenant Oliver Naquin never commanded another submarine. The Navy's decision was not punitive. The Board of Inquiry had fully exonerated him. Rather, it reflected the psychological toll of the disaster. Naquin was reassigned to surface ships and served as navigator on the heavy cruiser USS New Orleans during the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. At the Battle of Tasaparanga on November 30, 1942, the New Orleans was struck by a Japanese torpedo that severed 150 feet of her bow. Once again, Naquin survived a naval disaster through skilled seamanship and calm leadership. He helped save the ship, keeping her afloat and bringing her back to port. Naquin rose to the rank of Rear Admiral and retired from the Tea Navy in 1955, after a 34-year career. Oliver Nain lived until 1989, dying at age 85. Throughout his life, he deflected praise for the Squalus rescue, instead crediting his crew. "My officers and men acted instinctively and calmly," McCann said in interviews. "There were no expressions of fear and no complaints of the bitter cold. Never in my remaining life do I expect to witness so true an exemplification of comradeship and brotherly love. No fuller meaning could possibly be given the word shipmate than was reflected by their acts." Charles Momsen continued his distinguished naval career through World War II. His expertise extended far beyond submarine rescue. He was deeply involved in detecting and correcting faults in the Mark 114 torpedo. During the early years of the war, American submarines experienced an alarming number of torpedo failures. Torpedoes that hit their targets but failed to explode. The problem lay in the Mark 6 exploder mechanism. Momsen personally supervised investigations and field testing that identified the problems. His modifications, referred to as the Pearl Harbor modification by torpedo men, dramatically improved torpedo reliability and effectiveness. Momsen commanded Submarine Squadron 2 and, later, Submarine Squadron 4. In fall 1943, he evolved a doctrine whereby submarines could be organized into attack groups capable of operating deep in enemy-controlled waters. He commanded the first American Wolfpack. Riding aboard the submarine Cerro into the East China Sea, the Wolfpack tactic involved coordinated attacks by multiple submarines against Japanese convoys. The submarines under his command sank 5 Japanese ships totaling over 38,000 tons and damaged 8 ships totaling 63,000 tons. For this action, Momsen received the Navy Cross. His final wartime assignment came as commander of the battleship USS South Dakota. Under his command, the mighty battleship supported operations on Iwo and Okinawa. The South Dakota provided naval gunfire support during the amphibious assaults, her 16-inch guns hurling massive shells against Japanese positions ashore. Momsen rose to the rank of vice admiral before his retirement on September 1, 1955. He had served his country for 36 years. Charles Bowers Momsen died of cancer on May 25, 1967 at Bay Pines Veterans Hospital in Florida. He was 70 years old. Fittingly, he died on the anniversary of the completion of the Squalus rescue, the achievement that had vindicated his life's work. The Momsen Lung saved its first lives in combat conditions in October 1944. The USS Tang sank in 180 feet of water in the East China Sea after being struck by her own torpedo that circled back. 13 submariners used the Momsen Lung to reach the surface in a desperate escape from the flooded submarine. The ascent was harrowing. Men had to equalize pressure, exhale continuously to prevent lung rupture, and fight panic as they rose through the dark water. Of the 13 who attempted the escape, only 5 survived to be rescued by Japanese forces. 3 others reached the surface alive, but died during the night before rescue arrived, succumbing to hypothermia and injuries. The remaining 5 perished during the ascent. Despite the losses, the escape validated Momsen's original concept from 2 decades earlier. Without the Momsen Lung, none would have survived. Modern submarine rescue systems are direct descendants of Momsen's innovations. Today's submarine rescue chambers can operate at depths up to 850 feet. The pressurized rescue module developed in the 1990s can descend to 2,000 feet and carry up to 18 people. These systems incorporate lessons learned from the Squalus rescue. Refined through decades of technological advancement, the fundamental principle remains the same. A pressurized chamber mates with the submarine's escape hatch, allowing survivors to transfer without entering the water. Every submarine in the United States Navy is equipped with rescue features that trace their lineage back to the modifications Momsen championed. Escape trunks allow personnel to exit the submarine individually. Mounting rings around hatches provide attachment points for rescue devices. Emergency communication systems include buoys that can be released to mark the submarine's position and provide telephone contact with the surface. These systems have saved lives multiple times since World War II. The technical innovations pioneered during the Squalus operation extended beyond submarine rescue. The use of helium-oxygen mixtures for deep diving developed by Momsen and his team revolutionized commercial and military diving operations. Nitrogen and compressed air causes narcosis at depth, limiting how deep and how long divers can work. Replacing nitrogen with helium eliminated this problem. Modern deep-sea diving, underwater construction, and offshore oil platform work all rely on helium-oxygen mixtures that trace back to the Squalus rescue effort. The salvage techniques developed to raise the Squalus from 240 feet became standard procedures for recovering sunken vessels. The use of external lifting pontoons, carefully calculated buoyancy adjustments, and staged descents with pressure equalization became the foundation of modern salvage operations. These methods have been applied to countless salvage operations in the decades since. When submarines and ships sink, salvage teams use techniques pioneered by the men who raised the Squalus. In 1985, on the 46th anniversary of the rescue, surviving members of the Squalus crew held a reunion in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Over 20 former crew members attended, some bringing their children and grandchildren to see where they had been saved. The reunion was both celebration and remembrance. They visited the cemetery in Kittery, Maine, where their 26 lost shipmates were buried. They stood together at the graves, old men now, honoring the friends who had died in the flooded compartments. They stood on the shore looking out at the Atlantic waters that had nearly claimed their lives. Some wept, others simply stood in silence, remembering. Alan Carl Bryson lived until December 1st, 2008, the last surviving member of the rescued Squalus crew. He was 91 years old when he died, having lived 72 years longer than he would have without the McCann Rescue Chamber. Throughout his long life, Bryson attended reunions and spoke to naval groups about the rescue. He always emphasized the same message. The men who saved us were heroes, but the real hero was Swedson. He never gave up preparing for a disaster he hoped would never happen. When it did, he was ready. Innovation often faces resistance from established institutions. Visionaries who challenge conventional wisdom are marginalized, their ideas dismissed as impractical or unnecessary. Yet history belongs to those who persist, who continue working when others declare their efforts futile, who prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Charles Emson tested the Emson lung on himself at 200 feet depth, risking his own life. He advocated for the diving bell despite repeated rejections. He trained divers and refined procedures for disasters that had not yet happened. When the call came on May 24, 1939, he was ready. The submarine USS Squalus lies at the intersection of disaster and triumph. 26 men died in her flooded compartments, a sobering reminder that submarine service carries inherent risks. But 33 men survived because one officer refused to accept that submariners were doomed because he spent years developing an equipment others dismissed because he prepared for the worst day of his professional life. When that day came, Swedson and his team achieved what was considered impossible. They brought every living soul to the surface. They proved that hope and human ingenuity could triumph over the crushing darkness of the deep.